Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar panel on the future of drug addiction treatment. I'm Eric Nestler, director of the Friedman Brain Institute at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City, and it is a great pleasure for me to serve as moderator for today. Let me just say a few words about addiction. It's really impossible to overstate the impact that addiction has on humanity. Addiction is one of the top 10 causes of disability worldwide. In the United States alone, it's been estimated that the cost of drug addiction to society is on the order of $500 billion. And the COVID-19 pandemic that we've all lived through for over 18 months now has just underscored this impact. We've known that the incidence of drug addiction has increased perhaps 50% because of the pandemic. The number of drug overdoses, people dying from drug overdoses, has increased by 40% because of the pandemic. In 2020, over 90,000 Americans died of a drug overdose. I'm a product of the Vietnam generation. We've known that 58,000 American servicemen and women died over the course of the Vietnam War, and that's 15 years in running. And here we are for year after year after year, having more Americans die of drug overdoses than the entire Vietnam War. We desperately need to invest more in understanding and treating addiction, and that brings us to the topic of today's panel. I'll be happy to introduce 4 Mount Sinai experts to you. I'm just going to quickly mention them by name now, and then call on each of them in order to give a short talk. Then we'll have time after each talk to ask some questions, and then at the very end, have a general discussion. We encourage you to write your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll answer as many of the questions that you ask as possible. Joining us today, and I'll ask the panelists to please wave when I call their name. First up will be Yasmin Hurd, who's director of the Addiction Institute of Mount Sinai. After her, we'll be hearing from Xiaosi Gu, who is the director of the Center for Computational Psychiatry at Mount Sinai. Then Bagot will join us. Kara is Deputy Medical Director of Mental Health for the Adolescent Health Center at Mount Sinai. And batting cleanup will be Tim Brennan, who is Chief of Clinical Services of the Addiction Institute. So thank you all panelists for joining us. And Yasmin, I'm going to turn things over to you. Dr. Yasmin Hurd, thank you.
Thanks very much, Eric. Let me start sharing my screen and make sure everybody can see it.
Looks good.
Great. So, for us at Mount Sinai, the goal obviously is to provide healthcare and healthcare that's evidence-based. And so we have many different strategies, obviously, in which we do this, but translational advances for me is pretty paramount for a lot of the work that I do. As the director of the Addiction Institute, we cover not only the amazing basic science research and translational research at the Icahn School of Medicine, but the Manhattan that we cover, and even into Brooklyn, from our adolescent programs as CARES, participation with our medicine colleagues in the REACH program, but throughout Mount Sinai West, Beth Israel, and the halfway houses, every single thing is about how can we improve clinical care through science. And as Eric pointed out, I mean, the past year and a half has been particularly challenging for substance use, individuals suffering from substance use, from the stress, the social isolation that has increased the substance use population. Sorry, with my computer here just had a. So we see that there's increased use of substances over the past years, especially opioids. We also, because of that, as Eric pointed out, the drug overdose deaths that we were horrified before the pandemic that so many people could die, we still have the epidemic of opiate overdose that now, because of the pandemic, kind of got lost last year. So we've really high levels of death. And as we said, in terms of the amount of use the past year and a half with COVID has been extremely, even more worrying. So the question comes back to, what are we treating? What are we using to treat substance use disorders? And for my talk, I'm going to focus most on opiate use disorders for the obvious reasons. As you will see, for us, we have a history at Mount Sinai of treating people with opiate use disorders, and a large part of our legacy comes into being one of the first and the largest treatment with using methadone. And methadone, Bob Newman and the others that started in the Bernstein Institute of Beth Israel Hospital in 1964, that now obviously transitioned to the Addiction Institute at Beth Israel. But all of the treatments that have gone on for opioid use disorders, our legacy, as I said, is in methadone. But most of the treatments from Narcan, from naltrexone and buprenorphine still focus on opioids. So from 1964, the predominant treatments have still been opioids. And those have saved multiple lives. But still, only about 20% of people who need treatment for opioid use disorder receive it. And there are many reasons, from the stigma for many people not wanting to take opioids to the fact of the governmental regulations, even using opioid agonists to treat people with an opioid use disorder. And the list goes on. But a big question for us is that, can we start to leverage the information that we've been gaining from a lot of substantial basic science research and translational research about the neurobiology of addiction? So we know that many substances of abuse, they overlap on a number of neurobiological systems. The neurobiology of addiction is as complex as the disorder itself. So you have, the classic transmitters of dopamine, glutamate, GABA, but also our natural endogenous opioids and endocannabinoid system play a role. What many people think about when they think about the neurobiology of addiction is usually dopamine, that transmitter that many people in our society think about as being relevant to reward. So people take a drug, they feel the high when dopamine levels are up, and when dopamine levels are low, the dysphoria and the urges for continued drug use. And that has been a prominent feature of the neurobiology of addiction that's studied. But we now know from a lot of research that it's not that simple. And we know that synaptic plasticity is a critical aspect of what happens in the brain as the disorder, you could say, evolves. And this changes in synaptic plasticity involves many transmitter systems. Obviously, many people think about glutamate in this, but there are key brain regions that people study the most in terms of, like, for example, the striatum, that part of the brain that mediates the ventral part, the nucleus accumbens, that mediate reward, expectation, goal-directed behavior, but also the dorsal striatum that's important for habit formation, and obviously the cortices that are important for cognitive flexibility and so on. We know, as I said, that it's very complicated, so that there are neural circuits and many different molecular and cellular aberrations, I would say, in certain parts that are mediating substance use disorders. So for us, the question has always been, how do we translate the things that we're learning about the brain in a manner that can help give us indications about what are new strategies that we could try for developing medications that are perhaps not necessarily targeting the opioid receptors per se, but to try a different strategy. And a lot of the work that we do is a combination of human brain studies on molecular studies, and also using our preclinical animal models to then target give us insights into new neurobiological targets, and therefore that can guide clinical studies. So I'll just start out an overview of what have we learned in large part from the human brain. And from the human brain, you can sequence different brain regions that are important, that have been highly implicated, I should say, in addiction. I will say that substance use disorders are really a whole brain disorder, depending on the behaviors that you may be looking at. But here, for example, if we're looking at the nucleus accumbens or striatum, we see that there's significant dysregulation of genes in the brains of human heroin users. And where a lot of the changes that we see occur is in regard to genes related to synaptic plasticity, these glutamatergic genes and their networks, in terms of that alter how the neurons, the synapses, how neurons speak to each other through synaptic dysregulation. But importantly, these glutamatergic changes are consistent with what we know in terms of the glutamate coming from, for example, our prefrontal cortex, regulating the striatum. But the manner in which these disturbances are being mediated, we see these huge epigenetic changes. And so many people in our society, I think, now know about, epigenetics. But just briefly, you inherit your DNA sequence, your genetics from your parents. But one aspect of addiction and many disorders is that the environment can change, and not the DNA sequence, but whether or not genes are turned on and off. And drugs themselves serve to alter these epigenetic modifications on our DNA, and therefore can change how the neurons communicate and so on. And so, as I said, genes can either be closed or open and turned on and off. And what we see in the brains of human heroin users, again, as I said, these dysregulation on a molecular level related to synaptic plasticity, here just showing a prototypical glutamatergic gene, that it correlates to epigenetic marks and specific epigenetic marks in heroin users, but not in control subjects. And these epigenetic changes relate actually to the years of their heroin use. And this is really important. Importantly, we can see that these epigenetic changes, which there are a number of different epigenetic marks. I'm just focusing on one here today, like hyperacetylation, for example, is that we can not only see it in the human heroin users, we can replicate it in animal models where obviously we know their history, how much drug they take, their friends, their families, and so on. And by being able to replicate what we see of these epigenetic changes, we can now start to see, okay, can these epigenetic changes start to give us some insights into potential treatments? So, for example, some of the changes that we see that occurs in the brains of heroin users relate to epigenetic changes that are part of this increased acetylation that are read by these bromodomain readers, they're called. And the family of these bromodomain readers that we see, they're about 3 subtypes in the brain. And what we see that's changed, it's actually quite specific. It's not that every epigenetic modification is changed. And some of the specific ones we see are related to this epigenetic reader called BRD4, and it's increase in heroin users. And it correlates, in heroin users, it correlates to marks of synaptic plasticity. So that these epigenetic modifications are interesting from a medication development because we know that they can be targeted as they are in the cancer field, and inhibitors, for example, are developed. And we can see when we give animals these epigenetic inhibitors targeting these bromodomain, these BET inhibitors, we can actually reduce heroin self-administration. So these epigenetic disturbances might indeed prove to be relevant for targeting new treatment strategies. But it's not just for opioids. We see this from other researchers, that these changes in these epigenetic changes are there with other drugs of abuse. Here is, for example, cocaine. And again, you can normalize it by inhibiting these particular these epigenetic modifications. We can also look across the epigenome in the brains of heroin users, meaning we look in an agnostic manner as to where in the brain there, or I shouldn't say where in the brain, in a particular brain region, for example, again, the striatum, we can look and see where in the genome is the epigenetic changes most predictive of heroin users. And when we did that, we identified a gene called FIN. And FIN is interesting because FIN sits at this in this postsynaptic density, regulating synaptic plasticity, regulating glutamatergic signaling. And it's increased in heroin users, and we could replicate it in our animal models that self-administered heroin. Importantly, FIN is interesting because it phosphorylates tau. And as many of you know, hyperphosphorylated tau is a feature of a number of neurodegenerative disorders. When we look in the brain of heroin users, we actually see this increased hyperphosphorylated tau. And we can see that on many levels in our animal models also replicate this hyperphosphorylated tau with heroin use. Importantly, we can knock down that gene and normalize their heroin-seeking behavior. But for medication development, we want something pharmacological. And there are medications now being developed that are inhibitors of FIN, and even being tried for Alzheimer's disease. And when we administer, for example, sarcatinib to animals that self-administer heroin here during this time period with these arrows, it reduces their heroin self-administration behavior. And it's specific to the drug because if you give them this drug while they're self-administering natural rewards like food, it doesn't impact on that behavior, showing that there may be specificity, something very interesting for us now to move to clinical trials to be able to come up with novel treatments that are not opioid specific. So the last pathway that we see, at least what we're trying to develop in terms of new strategies, relates to the cannabinoid system. And this comes in large part as our society, many people have developed an opioid use disorder through trying to manage their pain. And so now with the legalization and decriminalization of cannabis, you can see that now people are thinking that cannabis might be a way out. And even for opioid use disorder, that cannabis might be a harm reduction. But we have been studying THC in a number of our animal models when we're studying the effects of cannabis to look at its long-term effect on the brain. And when we're studying THC, it's important, or when we're looking at cannabis in general, cannabis is a very complex plant with over 140 cannabinoids and other chemicals like terpenes that have biological activity or psycho and pharmacal activity. So we started looking at another cannabinoid, cannabidiol, or CBD, now that everybody in the world probably knows CBD. And what we saw was interesting because we saw that, well, this is an overview that now we know a lot of that cannabinoids are very different. So CBD and THC are very different. So THC is what mediates the reward, the intoxication, why people take it recreationally. Some people may say that THC decreases their anxiety, but it's a matter of dose. High dose, especially the cannabis on the streets today, usually promotes, induces anxiety, while CBD decreases anxiety. And the side effects are actually quite different between CBD and THC. We can come back to that in some of the questions. But what we saw that was interesting in our animal model was that there was a different pattern to the effects of these cannabinoids. So for example, in adults that had been exposed to THC earlier in life, they would invariably, for the most part, self-administer more heroin when given that opportunity. While CBD, we saw something unique. It actually decreased heroin-seeking behavior. So just like humans who suffer from a substance use disorder, environmental cues in general takes on a very salient impact in their craving, in their drug seeking, and therefore relapse. And in the animals, when they self-administer heroin, something goes off in their environment, whether a light or a tone or a smell that associates with the drug. And then when they see that cue, then they start pressing the lever even when they're not getting it. And this is what we consider drug-seeking behavior, and CBD reduced that cue-induced drug-seeking behavior. As I had mentioned that and showed, in human heroin users, there's this synaptic dysregulation and special glutamatergic genes. And in the animal models, you also see that self-administer heroin. And for, again, a prototypical gene that's dysregulated in heroin self-administering animals, CBD normalizes that. So we're able to conduct initial clinical studies with CBD in placebo, double-blinded controlled conditions. And we were able, with Ed Salsis, very great addiction medicine clinician, to see that when we showed people heroin cues as compared to neutral cues, and they had been given placebo, they craved. And CBD reduced that. In our animal model, we had seen that even a week or more after their last CBD administration, it was still having an effect. And when we brought people back into the lab a week after their last CBD, it also replicated what we saw in the animal models, namely that CBD continued to reduce their craving. We also saw similarly in our human subjects that anxiety was a key component of the effects of CBD. So if they had received placebo, they were more anxious. They reported more anxiety. A week later, CBD was still reducing their anxiety. Now we didn't know this at the time. Postdoc Jackie Ferlin, we now could go back to animal models and see that indeed CBD was affecting cue-induced anxiety. So if animals were exposed to a lemon cue, for example, with shock, and these are certain measures that are looking at anxiety, that those animals that got the cue, they showed the greater anxiety-related behavior, and CBD reduces that. We also could see in our human subjects, in terms of measuring not just the subjective effects of craving and anxiety, but also, for example, cortisol levels. When they had gotten placebo and they saw the drug cue, their cortisol levels went up and CBD reduced that. Similarly, their heart rate was increased if they had gotten placebo and during the drug cue presentation, and CBD reduces that. So for us, we think that CBD holds promise for opiate use disorder, especially in regard to cue-induced craving and anxiety, but dose and all of that matters, and the formulation matters. And so, that's really important. But I want to emphasize again, may not be specific for opioids, because preclinical studies also show this, for example, with alcohol, that CBD reduced alcohol seeking behavior in animals even months after their final CBD administration, and even in a very intense binge drinking alcohol model, but the sex mattered. So CBD didn't impact alcohol seeking behavior in the females at certain doses until they elevated the dose significantly. So there's a lot for us to do, and we're doing that. So here, Karen Baki, who's the operations beautiful for our clinical trial now, our UG3 with CBD for opiate use disorder, along with Ed Salsis and our great clinical team. And we're also with Enli Wang trying to understand the neural mechanisms by which CBD might be working to reduce craving and anxiety in people with a heroin use disorder. So for me, I think that the translational studies have really given us some insights into what are some new targets that we can have for treating opiate use disorders that are actually also relevant to other substances of abuse as well. So with that, I will stop. Let's say epigenetics is critical, and it means that since it's epigenetic, it's reversible. So I think we can indeed treat a lot more of these disorders.
Fantastic, Dr. Hurd. Thank you very much for beautiful talk. Science, cutting edge science, really nice. We do have one question from the audience. This is from Stuart Wasser, who asks whether the induction of fin that you described is also seen with buprenorphine.
It's a great question. And it's one that we're actually looking into to see in terms of the duration of the opioids that are needed to really elevate fin, because we see that this occurs more with repeated use. And if the type of opioid agonist makes a difference for induction of fin. But we think that indeed other opioids do induce fin. And so obviously that's something for us to look into long-term.
Uh-huh. And let me ask you to comment a little further on the cannabidiol. I think many people don't appreciate the difference between tetrahydrocannabinol, or the active ingredient in marijuana that might make a person high, versus cannabidiol. Can you just say a few words about that difference?
Absolutely. And I wish that we would be really clear when we talk about, like medical, quote unquote, medical marijuana and medical cannabinoids. Or medical cannabis. The THC and CBD are very different. CBD is non-intoxicating. There are many research clinical studies that have been done and have failed to find that it produces any high. CBD also is derived from, or we're allowed to use CBD derived from hemp, which has less than 0.3% THC. And when I say we're allowed to, based on being the federal government in terms of the DEA, that it's not scheduled if you work with CBD from hemp-derived products. But THC, we see, induces psychosis, induces anxiety, while a number of research studies have now shown CBD to even reduce psychosis, and even as an adjunct, maybe for some typical antipsychotic medications. So they're so different. And so cannabis with THC, many people may think of as a harm reduction strategy because it kind of induces the high, but it does not block the craving. It does not, or it does, I shouldn't say it doesn't block the craving, not on a biological level that you see with CBD, or the anxiety and the craving that you see with CBD.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's very helpful. One more question from the audience. We'll make this the last one for now, but come back to others at the end. This is someone who's asking for your thoughts on dronabinol. And I have to admit, that's a drug that I'm not familiar with.
So that is an approved cannabinol, THC from the approved scheduled drug. So dronabinol is definitely, it's used clinically. Many people, unfortunately, have side effects, just as we see with THC. As the dose gets higher, the intoxication and all of these, the negative effects as well. So dronabinol would be more of a harm reduction strategy than CBD. So again, because it has some rewarding effects.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's now turn to our second speaker, Dr. Xiaosi Gu. Xiaosi, go ahead.
Thank you, Eric. Let me just share my screen. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is actually taking the drug out of the addiction, which might seem to be a little controversial to start with. And hopefully by end of the talk, I'll be able to convince you that there is some evidence in humans, at least, that drugs is not all, right? After a very drug sort of focused talk. So the theme of this panel is the future of addiction treatment. And before we talk about the future, I think we actually have to talk about the present. What is the status quo that we're facing? So after decades of research, we actually have an overwhelming amount of knowledge at very fine, detailed sort of levels, such as beautifully demonstrated by Yasmin's talk. And this actually, I think, is maybe a figure from one of Eric's review papers. So we know a lot about the neurobiological mechanisms of the impact of drugs on the brain. And again, if you search in the literature, our publications in the drug addiction area has also gone up drastically, right? Other than this past year due to COVID. But in both animal and human research, we have made a lot of progress. On the other hand, again, this is actually just exactly what Eric mentioned in the opening speech, that unfortunately, reality is telling us otherwise, right? So especially you can see that after COVID, actually this new stats just came out demonstrating a very massive increase in drug overdose dose death in the past year. So what are we doing that is not right, that is sort of maybe partially contributing to this disconnection, right? This is a big question mark on many of our minds, including scientists, including clinicians, and also potentially policymakers. And one of the factors contributing to this that I'll propose here is what we call the parallel universe problem. What do I mean by that? Well, for the research field, because scientists have to, really dive deeper and focus on the thing they do, and there are many logistical reasons for that, we tend to sort of separate ourselves from our colleagues, right? Particularly those that don't work in close topics. For example, if you are a geneticist or if you are a molecular biologist, you're going to mostly be looking at the impact of drugs on the brain at very biological or physical aspects. But if you're a clinician or if you're a psychologist, then you're mostly be dealing with things that are very subjective and non-trackable, right? Things like feelings or craving or beliefs or even other drug memory, etc. So how do we deal with this disconnection or this dilemma we're facing? Well, in parallel to this, again, scientists are using very different, more sort of species to study the question, right? Of course, because of technical limitation for the physical space, we're mostly using rodents or non-human primates. But for these more subjective attributes of addiction, we very often have to study humans. Again, how do we bridge these two very different worlds together? Okay, so some of you might have already heard about this term, computational psychiatry. And I do realize I actually never put out an official definition of computational psychiatry in all of my previous talks. So here it is. Let's formally define it. Simply put, it is really a new field, and it's by definition highly interdisciplinary, that seeks to understand and characterize mental function, but importantly, mental dysfunction in terms of computations at the brain level, at the behavioral level, at the genetic level, etc. So it's a very broad definition, but fundamentally, what do you mean by computation? It's actually very intuitive if I ask you the following question. How do you break a computer? Or how do you break an AI if you try to hack AlphaGo, right? So there are a couple of ways to do that. This is the easiest way. You smash somebody's computer, right? You drop it, you break the hardware, then nothing works. Or you can do it in a more subtle way, a smarter way, but potentially more dangerous way, which is to infect it with a computer virus, which is essentially a piece of code. And that's the software of the computer, right? And using that analogy, it's nothing different when we think about mental dysfunction. Well, sometimes you actually do see things like this. These are structural deficits to the brain. And even when they may not be seen by your naked eyes, at finer grain structures, you can see potentially synaptic level or molecular level impairments in the brain. So that's actually very observable, right? That's the hardware of the brain. But how about this? similarly, you could actually have the software of the brain broken down and leading to similar mental dysfunction. So this is exactly the point I think we've been trying to make in the past decade or so, to sort of encourage everyone to come together, molecular scientists, bench scientists, and clinicians or cognitive scientists, to think about the brain in such way. Okay, so what does the current field look like? Just give you a very brief overview of the landscape of the field. So at the moment, when you hear the term computational psychiatry, it usually means one of the two or maybe three things, right? The most frequent thing you'll hear about is actually what's called the data-driven approach or data mining. And this is done largely, in terms of mining large databases. We can mine, very large genomic consortium. We can mine large fMRI data sets, MRI data sets, and we're trying to use these data sets to make predictions about individual patients, right? So that's usually the goal. And actually there's a decent literature on this, and you can sort of refer to this review paper about it. But at the very highest, but the other aspect is really what we consider to be the theory-driven and more mechanistic type of computational modeling. And that can be further divided into computational modeling of behavior and cognition, as well as biophysical modeling, right? So the biophysical modeling aspect usually touches on neuroactivity directly. So there are a lot of people building these synaptic models, recurrent network models, etc. That all belongs to this category. There's a lot of very promising work coming out. I think for addiction specifically, it really started out with this paper by Dave Reddish. It was a very influential paper and still, impacts a lot of the thinking in the field at the moment. And our group also has done some work in this area. Okay, so moving on, just to focus more narrowly on a very specific substance that my lab has focused on, which is nicotine. Again, thanks to all the bench work, we know that nicotine is a very powerful neuroactive substance. And we have, again, very detailed mapping of its of the anatomy of how nicotine impacts the brain, right? So we know that it binds to certain receptors in the brain. It can actually activate dopamine cells and also facilitate dopamine release. And this is exactly why nicotine is very difficult to quit, right? You might have heard people quitting all sorts of substances, but if you pay attention, actually those that use nicotine, either with cigarettes or the more modern form, electronic cigarettes or e-cigs, vaping devices, nicotine is very difficult to quit because this direct impact of dopamine amongst other neurotransmitters has a very profound reinforcing effect. And this work started actually when I was still a postdoc many years ago. And we showed, found some initial evidence that, hey, drugs might not be the entire story, that beliefs might just be as powerful as drugs. So in this particular study, we recruited a group of smokers, chronic smokers, heavily addicted, never tried to quit, never managed to quit. They came to the lab, we scanned their brain while they do kind of a reward task. And this is what you typically found, right? This part of the brain called the ventral striatum is usually activated in response to reward. So this is interesting because in smokers, we found that if we give them a cigarette to smoke and the cigarette had nicotine, and when we told them specifically this cigarette has nicotine, they did show this almost seemingly normal response, reward response in the brain. But we also had another condition where they smoked exactly the same cigarette with nicotine, but they were told there was no nicotine in the brain, in the cigarette. And this is what we found, right? And again, there is a lot of ideas coming out of this, right? Some of you might be wondering what is happening, what part of the brain, what is controlling this particular part of the brain that is so powerful, right? Can turn off this very usually robust reward response off directly. And we know this is a hugely biological response, right? Very dependent on the substance, but seem to be able to be turned off simply by an instructed belief in human subjects. So in summary, belief seemed to be able to override the effect of a powerful neuroactive substance on the brain. And this was a nice commentary written by actually Nora Volkov and Ruben Baylor, sort of demonstrating or speculating the impact of our brain, of our results in terms of behavioral intervention for addiction. Okay, so moving forward, we've shown belief about nicotine can have an on and off effect. But is it possible at all that we can even show a dose-dependent effect, right? Again, anyone that does neuropharmacological study would know that it's really critical actually to establish a dose-dependent curve for any drug you're studying. Can we do that, for beliefs? And we tried it. So we decided to now switch kind of the medium to electronic cigarettes for multiple reasons. But again, to save you all the details, the important thing here is that all the nicotine levels are equivalent between these different experimental conditions. And the only thing that was changed was, again, their belief about nicotine. And now you can see that we added, so we have a total of 3 conditions, right? And we told them either the nicotine was very weak, or it could be a medium strength or a very strong high strength of nicotine. So that's it, really. It's a very kind of vague instruction in a way, but this is how people typically describe, right, a substance, whether it's weak, medium, or strong. And we run exactly the same experiment. We scan smokers' brains as they perform a reward task. And this task, again, can give us computationally or mathematically derived reward learning signals. And then we ask the subjects at the end of the study, how strong do you think the nicotine was, right? This is both a manipulation check to make sure that the experimental design actually worked, but also to sort of really get to their subjective belief aspect. And interestingly, but nicely worked for us, that at a group level, subjects did believe, right? So their belief also became sort of stronger or higher as a function of what we told them, right? So this is when we told them it's low versus medium versus a high strength, and then the belief rating sort of scaled accordingly with lots of individual variation. In terms of the brain, we also found a very nice signature that scaled almost completely parametrically with the belief. So this is a part of the thalamus. And you can see that this is a sort of a reward-specific computation in the thalamus that was almost non-existent or slightly negative in the low belief condition, becomes a little bit more positive, and then hugely positive for the high belief condition, right? So this is very nice because this paralleled very nicely with the behavioral results. And you might wonder, what does this part of the thalamus do? Well, it turns out that there are some very interesting PET imaging studies in whole brain imaging in humans, demonstrating that this part of the thalamus is actually has one of the highest concentrations of nicotinic receptors. And we know the thalamus is very important for attention, arousal, and gating functions. So there's a lot of follow-up work to do, right? And finally, we also interrogated, is there any other region involved in this, or is the thalamus kind of a one-person shop, right? That's the only region we really found. So it turns out that if we look at the functional connectivity, meaning that the communication between different brain parts, we also saw a very nice prefrontal and thalamus connection being modulated in this parametric fashion by beliefs, right? As you can see, this is a very particular technique that people commonly use. And specifically, this is the ventral medial part of the prefrontal cortex, and it's also being shown to involve in reward and value representation. Okay, that's it. And I just want to wrap up and tell you sort of a taster of what we're doing next, or what is the future of addiction treatment and research. So again, thanks to the computational tools we have, we're very sort of lucky that we have made this new technique work in the lab. It's a AI, or artificial intelligence, or you can call it machine learning enhanced neurochemistry technique that would allow us to directly sense or detect dopamine traces in the human brain as they are actually awake and behave. Specifically, we're planning to run all these reward tasks that I just told you about in humans. So again, you don't need to know all the technical details, but just to show you that this is really leveraging some of the neurosurgical patients we have here, where we can put our electrodes down to these important regions for addiction, including both the ventral and dorsal striatum. And actually, so far, and also midbrain. So far, we've actually managed to record from substantia nigra, globus pallidum, ventral pallidum, as well as one cortical region. And this part is to be continued. Okay, summary. So hopefully I've convinced you that through computational psychiatry, we can really find a viable path to really deal with the complexity of the human brain in particular, and really to truly connect bench work with clinical questions and needs beyond just the talking points or the things we write in grants. And through one or two examples, I've shown that drug-induced signals in the brain are not as hardwired as we might have thought. And for example, a simple manipulation of human beliefs can actually turn up or down that signal and can have a very powerful influence on both brain and behavior, right? Even in a dose-dependent fashion. And finally, what we're currently leveraging with these modern computational tools and techniques with patients with implants and can really allow us to directly study all the questions that we think are essential to addiction in humans, right? This can potentially really transform our understanding of addiction amongst other neuropsychiatric disorders. I will stop here, and just to give you a very positive end note that the future is already here. And thank you to my amazing lab. This was really a heroic effort from the entire team and many important collaborators, and also very, thanks to our funding agencies. And I have 1 minute left, and I just want to also brag about our new Center for Computational Psychiatry. We're doing a lot of addiction work. We're doing a lot of other interesting work with relevance to addiction. So check us out.
Fantastic, Xiaosi. Thanks for that very interesting talk, really at the interface in some ways of psychotherapy and the brain, the notion of beliefs influencing the brain in response to drugs. In fact, one of the questions from the audience, this is from Zena Hyman, is asking whether what you were describing is similar to the placebo effect, which I thought was an interesting way of framing what you've been observing.
Yes, that's a great question. And actually, that's a question I always get. So I'm very happy to take that. The answer is that the high-level implication is similar, right? That beliefs in the placebo condition, of course, the active substance is absent, but the brain can mimic a response as if it is there. So on that note, it's similar, but actually the direct sort of findings are very different because it's the complete opposite of the placebo effect. Because we're showing that when you have a neuroactive substance in the brain, you can still turn that up or down, right, with belief manipulation. And so we're continuing to explore this, with people that are really experts on psychotherapy and other type of behavioral interventions. But yes, definitely a very interesting topic.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read another question to you. This is from Stuart Wasser. Since certain cigarettes are smoked ritually and not due to nicotine withdrawal, I would like to know if the effects on the brain were seen in those who may have been in significant nicotine withdrawal, say 12 or 24 hours after the last cigarette. Did your studies control for when the last use of nicotine took place? I think is the kernel of the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the studies that I showed you, they were actually allowed to smoke as usual, but we actually did run a separate study where we deprived the smokers for, I believe, it's between 12 to 24 hours, which is really torture for these guys, right? And we found something very different. And long story short, we found that in that cohort, belief still had an impact on the brain, but it's a different part of the brain called the insular cortex that we thought is really important for craving and interoceptive states. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And let's take one more question. And I want to thank the audience for entering so many in the Q&A. Please keep them coming. We'll come back to many more during the general discussion period. But here's a question from Michael Dillman, who's asking if beliefs can influence the effect of drugs on the brain. What about hypnosis?
I would love to know. So, in fact, I know there are studies, neuroimaging studies with hypnosis. I don't know if they're considered really clinical trials, but I know of such studies. I think, obviously, the study I know about was funded, I think, by DARPA or DOD. I think that historically it's been maybe a little challenging to get these studies funded by NIH. But anyway, it's a very interesting area I think we should just stay open-minded, right? Of course, there are so many things about the brain, especially human brain states, that we don't really fully understand. These semi-conscious state or instructed state or induced perturbed states without drugs. That's a huge area to explore. And, I'm not an expert on this topic, but I think it's definitely an open area we should look at.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, what a fascinating and optimistic view of possible treatments for addiction in future years. Thank you very much. Let's move on to our third panelist today, Dr. Kara Bagot. Kara, take it away.
All right, great. Thank you, Eric. So let me share my screen. Okay. So I just wanted to start out by saying that, so the talk that I'm going to give today is a little bit different than what's in the program. So instead of talking about the adolescent brain and cognitive development study, I'm going to talk about a separate cohort here at Sinai. So I did this sort of swap just to be consistent with the other speakers, but also because I think that the clinical populations that we see here at Sinai are very rich. There's a rich amount of diversity that we don't see in sort of national samples. The other reason why I sort of swapped out talks and like developed a new talk based on these clinical populations is because the adolescent brain and cognitive development, or ABCD cohort, was recruited relatively young. And so they haven't aged into a significant amount of substance use as of yet. So I thought that this would just be more interesting and sort of consistent with the talks we're hearing about today. So instead, I'm going to talk about substance use among racial and ethnic and gender minority urban youth. So just a little bit of background. I'm going to talk about the Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center because this is where we've drawn this population. So here at Adolescent Health, we see about 12,000 youth every year between the ages of 10 to 26 years of age. It is the largest adolescent-specific primary care facility in the U.S., and we're really based on an integrated medical, sexual, and reproductive health, behavioral and mental health, optical, dental, legal, and health education services model. And so all these services are provided at our primary site at no cost to patients. There are also 6 school-based health centers throughout Manhattan that serve 24 high schools that provide primary medical care as well as mental health care, again, at no cost to patients. Our patient population is largely youth of color, almost 95% youth of color, so 44% identify as Hispanic, about a third identify as non-Hispanic Black, 14% mixed race, 6% non-Hispanic white, and 4% Asian. Almost 100% of the youth that we serve come from low socioeconomic status backgrounds or low income backgrounds. Many are uninsured or underinsured, about a third are on Medicaid. And these are really low resource communities that these kids come from. They reside within the bottom 10 of New York City's 42 neighborhoods for health indicators. And so when we think about risk in general among adolescents and adolescent substance users, we know that adolescence is really marked by high impulsivity and risk-taking. And that's largely due to sort of differential brain development over the course of adolescence into young adulthood. In the US, over 4,300 adolescents initiate substance use for the first time every day. And so we know that adolescence is a really key period in which to study substance use and sort of the substance use trajectory overall. And in fact, SAMHSA data shows that that the period between 12 to 17, traditional adolescence is really the most high risk period among youth, followed by then transitional age youth from 18 to 25. And so cannabis, alcohol, and nicotine tobacco are the 3 primary substances of use among adolescents and transitional age youth. And we see higher rates of use of these substances in inner city youth as compared to sort of nationwide studies. We also know that minority status is associated with substance use. And when I talk about minority, underrepresented minority, I'm really thinking more broadly than just racial and ethnic minorities, although that's quite important, but also gender and sexual minorities as well. And then we know adolescents with substance use disorders also have a high degree of psychiatric comorbidity. And so the relationships between sort of individual and community level risk factors and social determinants of health and the substance use trajectory and psychiatric comorbidity is actually quite complex. So now looking more specifically at risk among underrepresented minority populations, in particular gender and racial ethnic minority youth, we know that negative substance use related outcomes disproportionately affect girls and women, so females. So females are more likely to experience telescoping. So that's a reduced time from initiation of substance use to problematic or disordered use. And we see telescoping particularly among Black females. Among cannabis users, we also see higher rates of diagnosed cannabis use disorder among females. Females tend to self-report higher levels of drug craving, intensity of withdrawal, and are at greater likelihood of relapse. So then looking sort of at the literature around substance use in racial ethnic minority youth, we know that there is a unique impact of social determinants of health on the substance use trajectory. So that includes stress related to acculturation, racial and ethnic discrimination or social injustice, low socioeconomic status or poverty, and reduced access to educational and vocational opportunities, as well as quality healthcare. However, despite all this, there's really like a dearth of investigation of substance use trajectories, primarily among minority, so racial and ethnic minority, but gender and sexual minority youth as well, particularly among youth of color. And so this is of concern because we have a growing population of youth of color in this country, and we're also sort of more focused in the clinical sphere on sort of intersectionality. So looking at how individual level attributes like race and class and gender and sexual identity and socioeconomic status sort of combine and act together to increase risk, especially around substance use in youth. So the aim of this study, and what I'm going to talk to you for the bulk of today about, was to identify substance use trends within primarily Black and Hispanic female adolescents and transitional age youth, and then investigate how these interact with other risk factors that are known to be associated with substance use. And so I took out the piece with associations with risk factors just because of time, but I'm always happy to answer any questions about that. So like I mentioned before, our participants for this study were taken from the broader Adolescent Health Center clinical cohort. But here we're just looking at females, so about 1,600 females. They were 13 to 21 years of age at enrollment. Enrollment is rolling, it's an ongoing study. So study initiation was in October 2007. And here I'm going to present data through 2020 or through 30 years of age, whichever is later. And study visits were every 6 months. So data collection was every 6 months. So in terms of measures, we looked at demographics, obviously, so age, race and ethnicity, use of social services like women, infants and children, food stamps, Medicaid, welfare checks, utilizing free breakfast or lunch, and who these youth lived with most of the time as a proxy for parental monitoring. In terms of substance use, we looked at, we used the craft, the 6-item craft as to look at sort of problematic substance use among this cohort, and then a self-report questionnaire of lifetime and past 30-day use of cannabis, alcohol, nicotine, and tobacco, and illicit substances. I'm going to really focus here, though, mostly on cannabis, alcohol, and nicotine and tobacco, again, because there are just higher rates of use among this sort of 13 to 26 age range. So also looking at sort of other risky behaviors, like risky sexual behaviors. So data was collected on sex of recent sexual contacts and the number of lifetime and recent sexual partners, and then a number of psychopathological measures, which I'm not going to get into today, but again, can answer questions about examining depression, anxiety, trauma, and delinquency. And so just in terms of the cohort characteristics, nearly half of the sample was enrolled at sort of late adolescence, so 17 to 18. The next sort of biggest chunk, about a third of the cohort, were transitional age youth or young adults from 19 to 21, and then 20% of the cohort represents early to mid adolescents, 13 to 16 years of age. A very large proportion of this cohort received social services, over 80%, and 3/4 of the cohort reported living with at least one parent. And so looking at race and ethnicity longitudinally among this cohort, so over 50% of the youth in this study at every single time point self-identified as African-American or Black, and nearly 60% at every single time point across the study identified as Hispanic as well. And so now looking at problematic substance use, and again, within this context, defined as 2 or more yes answers on the 6-item craft, we see that over time, the prevalence of problematic substance use among this primarily Black, primarily Hispanic female cohort has increased. And that is tracked along with increasing rates of co-use or concurrent tobacco and marijuana use. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So we saw problematic substance use, again, associated with time, so increasing over time, co-use of cannabis and tobacco use. It was associated with increased odds of lifetime illicit substance use past 30-day, alcohol use, and sexual orientation, or being in a same-sex relationship. And so in the next few slides, I'm going to compare our data here on this at Adolescent Health Center in the primarily Black, Hispanic, female cohort to national data. So when I present data from our own cohort, it's mostly divided by age. So blue representing adolescents, so 13 to 17, and this pink purple color representing transitional age youth or young adults. And so we see here that cannabis use the prevalence of cannabis use has increased significantly over time for both sort of cohorts, the adolescents as well as the transitional age youth. And that we see that past 30-day use of cannabis has nearly doubled for the adolescents from about 29% in 2009 to 60% in 2019. We also see that frequent use, which is defined as using 20 or more days in the past 30 days, has more than doubled from about 4.5%-ish in 2009 to 10% currently. And so now when we compare this with national rates among adolescents, so none of this is transitional age youth, but sort of traditional adolescents from 12 to 17, 18, not only are we not seeing the decline or sort of the stabilization of cannabis that we're seeing nationally, we're seeing just like much greater rates of use among, again, this primarily Black and Hispanic female population. And so here, if we look at lifetime rates, we see that both for marijuana and vaped marijuana across adolescents, so early adolescents were represented in blue, mid-adolescents represented in yellow, and late adolescents represented in red. We're seeing lifetime rates anywhere between 10% to 43%. And so that's compared to lifetime marijuana use in our sample of 81%. So it's greater. So the Adolescent Health Center population is using it 2 to 8 times greater than national data, which is sort of not as representative. It's a majority white population. And so now if we look at past month marijuana use, either smoked marijuana or vaped marijuana, we see that nationally rates are anywhere from 4 to 21%, and that's compared to past month marijuana use in our cohort of 60%. So that we see that, that rates are higher here, anywhere from 3 to 15 times fold. So now when we look at vaping marijuana more carefully among our cohort, we see that there's quite a divergence from the national rates. So our rates tend to be extremely low among the kids that are using marijuana. So past 30-day use, about 10% have vaped marijuana, and that maybe about 1 to 2% report frequent use of vaped products. So not only are we not seeing the high and increasing rates that we see nationally, we're just seeing sort of flat, stabilized, and very low rates among Black and Hispanic females. So now looking at frequent cannabis use, we see that odds of frequent cannabis use increased 18% per year of the study. We also found that frequent use in the past 30 days was associated with a greater number of recent sex partners, so indicating sort of other risk-taking behaviors. We see associations with sex with both men and women. We see frequent cannabis use also associated with greater odds of tobacco and alcohol use in the past 30 days or lifetime illicit substance use. And then switching gears and talking about nicotine and tobacco use, we've seen sort of steady declines among our Black and Hispanic female cohort. And it's particularly pronounced among the adolescents and a little bit less so among the young adult or transitional age youth cohort, although it's declining too. And so 2011-12-ish really seems to be the turning point in our population for nicotine and tobacco use. And so now when we compare this to national rates, again, for adolescents alone, after several years of decline in sort of cigarette use, we're seeing now slight increases both in lifetime and past month use, and maybe a stabilization of vaping over the past month. And so looking in direct comparison with our own data, we see that lifetime sort of cigarette or nicotine use for youth nationally is anywhere between 11% to 44%. And in our cohort, it's about lifetime use is about 22%. And that's the record low for our cohort. So at the record low, our Black and Hispanic female youth cohort is now at sort of the national average. If we look at past month use nationally, we see rates of anywhere from 2 to 24%, 24-25%. And again, that's across adolescents, early to late adolescents. In our cohort, we see rates at about 5%. So suggesting that Black and Hispanic females are actually using nicotine and tobacco at lower rates or at the low end of rates that we see nationally. And so that's kind of deceiving because we see really high rates actually of marijuana and tobacco co-use and as well as concurrent use. And the majority of use of cannabis in our population is actually in combination with tobacco. So it's either in specified blunts, which we see represented at the bottom in the burnt orange color, or the orange, the brighter orange above it, the yellow color is there, and the bottom two green colors are all blunt use, representing both tobacco and marijuana. And then we also see a significant number of youth adding tobacco to blunts or adding tobacco to marijuana and using it simultaneously. We're also seeing increasing rates of concurrent marijuana and tobacco use over time, which is represented by the blue bar at the bottom. And so given that we're seeing increasing marijuana, tobacco, and tobacco use like combined in this cohort, but seeing really significantly declining tobacco use, self-reported tobacco use, it's likely an underestimation of tobacco use among this cohort. So when they're asked about tobacco use alone, they're likely not considering the fact that there's tobacco in blunts. So combining the two age groups and looking at alcohol use over time, we see that alcohol has really remained stable, high but stable. So lifetime use is about 90%, past 30-day use 70%, and frequent use is 10%. And so again, comparing that to national rates, we see that the trend is the same, that it's remained relatively stable. However, we're seeing higher lifetime rates anywhere about 2 to 4-fold higher rates among our Black and Hispanic female cohort. And then in past month use, we're seeing 2 to 7 times higher rates among our cohort as well. So just sort of ending on future directions, what does this mean? So now that we know that there are significant disparities in substance use trajectories and rates among gender and racial and ethnic minority youth, like what are we to do about this? So I think on sort of a macro level, we know that social determinants of health are really important risk factors in terms of substance use trajectory and psychopathology in youth. And so from like a high level, we can start looking at how lack of access to quality education and healthcare, neighborhood and social and community characteristics, and poverty specifically these factors interact with one another to impact substance use and psychopathology in youth. And at like a policy level, start enacting policies at a local and a federal level to sort of change some of these risk factors. And then thinking about sort of where we land in medicine, sort of rethinking translational medicine. And so I'm going to rethink it even more than Xiaosi did. So instead of thinking of translational medicine only as sort of a bench researcher, then moving on to preclinical research, then moving on to patient populations, and instead of these sort of different components working in isolation, thinking about clinicians that work with at-risk populations as the starting point for sort of identifying subpopulations with disproportionately poor outcomes. And then having those clinicians and those at-risk populations partner with researchers and other community stakeholders within these at-risk communities to identify specific areas of vulnerability and risk. And then from there, researchers can continue to collaborate with these at-risk communities and clinicians that serve these communities to develop and test individualized and targeted prevention and treatment interventions. And then, so we have the researchers, the clinicians, the community partners working to implement treatments at the community level and disseminate them among at-risk populations in the community across health systems. So, just finally, the last thing is working with youth populations. We really need to meet youth where they are at. And so in some respects, we're doing this already. So I've described at the Adolescent Health Center, like literally meeting kids where they exist in schools, right? So we have a number of school-based health centers. In the bottom right picture, Shilpa Taufik is the director of CARES. Through CARES, there are also school-based health centers really targeted towards substance use treatment and mental health treatment for at-risk kids that have been involved with the juvenile justice system and those non-college enrolled transitional age youth that are at very high risk of substance use. And then also thinking about like sort of one-stop shopping for these youth. So providing places where kids can go to get comprehensive services. So I described sort of our adolescent healthcare model already, but it CARES, again, at an alternate site at Mount Sinai. They provide high school education as well as substance use treatment and mental health treatment. And so I just want to say a quick thank you to Angela Diaz. She's the director of the Adolescent Health Center. Ann Nucci is the medical director of the Adolescent Health Center. Nicholas Schlecht and Robert Burke are MPIs on the R01, from which this data that I just presented came from, and their individual research teams at Roswell Park and Einstein. All the clinical and research staff here at Adolescent Health that do really great work working with like very vulnerable populations, and then all the patients that we are really privileged to serve here at Adolescent Health and that teach us new things all the time. Thanks.
Fantastic, Kara. So yes, good. Excellent. So we do have a couple of questions from the audience. Let's start with this one from Sarah King, who's asking, what have you seen in terms of the effect of the pandemic on substance abuse among adolescents?
Yes, so great question. So I think locally here within the city, as well as nationally, we've seen increased rates of substance use. And again, I think, so within COVID, we've seen sort of health disparities in infection rates and things like that, and poor outcomes related to COVID itself. And we're seeing the same thing in substance use as well. And so we're still seeing those health disparities across adolescent substance users. So not only in their substance use, and sorry, my camera keeps going in and out. Every time I move, it tries to refocus. I apologize for that. So we're seeing increased rates, particularly in alcohol and cannabis use, less so in nicotine and tobacco use. But we're also seeing that increased anxiety, rates of anxiety and depression are predicting increases in substance use as well, particularly in our population, our primarily Black and Hispanic population, both females and males.
Mm-hmm. And then one more question. This is from Jeff Flynn, who asks whether there's evidence of whether we can more effectively treat substance use disorders if caught early, say treating an adolescent as opposed to waiting for that individual to perhaps get into greater trouble with the addiction and then treating them later in life. Are there any data to advise on that?
Yeah, so 100%, like early intervention is always best. I mean, I think that the prevention literature is a little bit confusing because there are differences between universal prevention, where we give sort of prevention interventions to everybody, versus targeted prevention intervention. And so the literature around targeted prevention intervention, so reaching out to the communities that we know are at the highest risk of developing substance use disorder, is effective. Universal prevention, like the DARE program and things like that, have not been shown to be as effective.
Right, so that's a critical distinction of the importance of really identifying individuals who are more at risk.
Exactly, yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Kara. Okay, so let's turn to our last panelist. After this presentation, we will have time for general discussion, so please stick with us and ask questions in the Q&A for all four panelists. Next up is Dr. Tim Brennan. And Tim, looks like you're way ahead of me. Have your slides ready to go. They look good. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nestler. Thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to speak with you all this afternoon. I'm going to make brief remarks about COVID-19. No academic symposium would be complete without, of course, referencing COVID-19. And I'm going to speak about COVID-19 and addiction and attempt to answer the question of whether this pandemic is a perfect storm. Credit to me, by the way, for that photograph. Or perhaps a perfect opportunity, perfect timing for our field. In order to present my remarks about where I think COVID has led us, I want to take us on a brief journey. And I think what I'd like to do is talk about where we were. I'd like to talk about where we are. And if I can be so bold, I will suggest where we might want to go in the future. Now, I won't bury the lead here. I choose to view the COVID-19 pandemic, despite all of its horrific misery, as the perfect opportunity, the perfect accelerant, the perfect catalyst by which we can advance our field of addiction into a place that's grounded in science, equitable for all, and patient and family centered. So before we get there, let's talk about where we were. Now, the origin story of America's relationship with substances is a very old one. When it comes to opioids, in fact, they were first used in the Civil War and then became a huge problem in the 1900s. This is a terrific advertisement of a product called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, which was available in pharmacies and general stores throughout America. You could quite literally buy opioids over the counter. And what we ended up seeing quite literally was poisoning happening at scale of America's children. And so that led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1904, which itself became the kind of precursor act to an organization that we now know as the Food and Drug Administration. The American addiction care origin story begins in the 1930s. And it's a story that quite literally begins in basements of places of worship and recreation centers and other community settings. Talking, of course, about community self-help groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and later Narcotics Anonymous. These groups are the literal bedrock foundation upon which all of modern addiction care is built. In fact, it's hard for you to find an American addiction center that doesn't describe itself as perhaps based in the 12 steps or 12 steps friendly. And that all comes, of course, from this foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. Now, this is a very proud legacy. But we need to remember that this world was non-regulated. This care was provided by people who were non-credentialed by any professional body. And the care was fundamentally non-medical. Now, flash forward, if you will, to the 1960s, the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And what we found was that American GIs were returning home from Southeast Asia with staggering rates of opioid use disorder, probably because they were exposed to very high quality, highly potent heroin and opium right there in the Vietnam theater. So, and there was also a burgeoning heroin crisis that at the time was primarily isolated in poor and often urban communities. So thanks to some pioneering scientists, not too far from where I'm sitting right now at Rockefeller University, talking, of course, about Dr. Marie Neiswander, Dr. Mary Creek, and who recently passed away, and Dr. Vincent Dole, they had the good sense to test a long-acting opioid medication, which we now know as methadone, as an opioid replacement therapy. Methadone, by the way, was a creation of the Germans during the Nazi regime. It actually came about due to the opium shortage that was affecting Germany in the Second World War. The opium routes, which had been honed through millennia, were really disrupted during the World War II. And Drs. Neiswander, Drs. Creek, and Dr. Dole were thankfully able to get methadone approved by FDA for use in opioid use disorder. But this was a very convoluted and arduous and fascinating story that really encompasses the stigmas associated with opioid replacement therapy. Some legislators and regulators had profound concern about diversion and trafficking rather. So what resulted was this really bewildering, outright draconian framework of regulations under which we still toil today. And so as of 1973, 1 in 5 US soldiers was using heroin, and we suddenly found ourselves confronted with this new treatment paradigm of methadone maintenance. But the treatment paradigm that was created was essentially an apartheid system where methadone maintenance had to be done outside of regular medical facilities. And so you had all problems of the mind and body being treated right there in the hospital and this other problem of opioid use disorder being treated quite literally around the corner. And that's still a problem now today. And like I said, it is a bewildering and draconian framework of regulations. So let me give you some examples. Number one is it is very, very hard to receive guest dosing of methadone in most parts of the United States. We do a whole lot of guest dosing here at Sinai, and we're very proud of that. But good luck traveling to other parts of the country and receiving guest dosing if you find yourself on methadone maintenance. People who are incarcerated in prisons are oftentimes forcibly tapered from their methadone maintenance because prisons simply don't provide methadone maintenance treatment. Likewise, there are confidentiality laws out there. For example, if a patient is on methadone, which is of course not a harmless drug, we're not allowed to tell other physicians without their permission that they're on methadone. And finally, as far as the way methadone's dosed, patients start their journey on methadone maintenance by coming to the clinic for 6 out of 7 days per week, right? Most of us don't do anything 6 out of 7 days per week. We don't even come to work 6 out of 7 days per week. And when they come, they have to queue up in a line with other patients and receive their medication from underneath a window, which in many clinics is actually a bulletproof glass window. So describing methadone maintenance as dehumanizing, I think is being rather kind. So flash forward to the early 2000s, and we see a staggering increase in synthetic opioid prescriptions, largely due to physicians that did not realize that opioids were neither indicated for the treatment of chronic pain or that synthetic opioids were addictive. And of course, we now know that they were very addictive, and we're still sorting out how to blame folks for that issue. But by the late 2010s, many of you probably remember this, you really couldn't pass a newsstand without seeing a publication describing the so-called opioid crisis. Indeed, the opioid crisis has kind of become its own cottage industry of movies, books, television shows, and magazines. Entire careers have been crafted on telling the story of opioid addiction from all sides. It essentially has become its own genre. Now, the good news about the rise of the American opioid crisis is that it gradually led to a reckoning for American physicians and American healthcare. Prescribing rates of synthetic opioids actually plummeted in the mid-2010s. Unfortunately, many patients actually had to switch to illicit opioids and products like heroin when they were no longer able to get their opioid pills from their prescriber. But if we examine this graphic of overdose deaths involving any opioids by gender, we see this subtle but very important plateauing from 2017 to 2019. It seemed somewhat that perhaps the opioid crisis was leveling off. Physicians were prescribing less, and these deaths had started to gradually plateau. Now, we're not really sure the exact reasons why things were leveling off. Perhaps it was education efforts, targeted interventions, as Dr. Bagot told us about. Perhaps it was better access to treatment, or maybe the disease had run its course in the American population. We're really not quite sure, but addiction professionals were very pleased with this data set and where we were heading in late 2019. In fact, as a field of addiction medicine and addiction psychiatry, we were growing at extraordinary rates. Here at Mount Sinai, you saw an increase in services. There's fellowships that are training physicians. There's education for the medical students and the residents and fellows. Things were headed in the right direction. But enter, of course, COVID-19. As we all probably remember, it seemed like America changed overnight. Many of us probably have a psychological marker from the night of March 11th, 2020, which was the night that Rudy Gobert of the Utah Jazz tested positive for COVID. They canceled an NBA game between the Utah Jazz and the Oklahoma City Thunder. And then several hours later, the famous actor Tom Hanks announced that he had contracted COVID. And I think it felt like the lights had gone off suddenly all around the country. And as those days turned to weeks, and as those weeks turned to months, American addiction providers, like all healthcare providers, had to adapt their practices. So here at the Addiction Institute of Mount Sinai, we migrated basically all of our patients to telemedicine. We were connecting with them through Zoom and other platforms. It wasn't easy to do. A lot of people weren't able to use these platforms. Now, fortunately, and to be frank, rather surprisingly, in the field, we saw a sudden and profound loosening and liberalization of regulatory policies from places like the Department of Health and OASIS here in New York, as well as SAMHSA, DEA, and the FDA at the federal level. Whereas before the pandemic, we couldn't prescribe buprenorphine over the phone. Now, not only could we prescribe buprenorphine over the phone, but we could commence buprenorphine on new patients over the phone. Likewise, methadone maintenance patients were allowed to receive take-home doses at much higher rates than before. Here in New York City, they even started delivering methadone to people right in their homes. Imagine that. People could actually get their medicine without having to queue up in that dreaded line at the clinic. How novel. Sadly, while this liberalization energized a lot of us in the field, it didn't prove to be enough as far as the disease of addiction. The early data from 2020 and 2021, while not yet published in large form, suggests that this plateau has unfortunately gone away. Addiction overdoses are now worse than they have ever been. The opioid crisis is worse than it has ever been. There's some early data from opioid overdoses, a retrospective study of the National Emergency Medical Services Information System, which is a database of basically EMS providers, looked at 47 states and found that the 2020 values were increased by 50% as far as opioid overdoses. CDC has reported dramatic increases. Again, they haven't reported this data formally, but things seem to be significantly worse. Likewise, alcohol sales and alcohol use disorder incidence is thought to have gone up. Alcohol sales, by the way, increased 54% from 2019 to 2020. And online orders of alcohol increased by 262% from 2019 to 2020. So to be very clear, whatever momentum that we had between 2017 and 2019 on this graphic seems to have gone away. Now, many have postulated that perhaps loneliness or decreased access to social support structures, widespread unemployment, or anxiety regarding the pandemic have all led to this backsliding of progress. But rather than talk about all this doom and gloom, perhaps there's a ray of hope. Perhaps the COVID-19 pandemic was the perfect accelerant for regulators and clinicians to finally take that bold step into the future. And the real point of my talk is that perhaps we can not just walk into the future, but sprint into the future. So what might a future state of addiction care look like in America? Well, to be clear, it would involve more access to care. The sad reality of American addiction care is that most people who have it don't ever have the disease of addiction, don't ever get treatment. And we see other chronic conditions like hypertension, diabetes, and depression. Those patients are receiving treatment at far higher rates compared to patients with addiction. Well, what else might we be able to do as we look to the future? For starters, we might want to look to our friendly neighbors to the north in Canada. In Canada, there are no lines for methadone clinics because patients on methadone don't go to methadone clinics. They go to pharmacies to receive a dose of methadone that they can take privately and discreetly. They don't tend to even interact with each other because they're at the pharmacy at their appointed time. Now, we have the infrastructure in America to accomplish that type of transition probably within a week or so. There are retail pharmacies in almost every town, and it feels like here in Manhattan, there's a retail pharmacy on every corner. Now, why on earth would we make someone go to a clinic and wait online with other people with that same disease, with all of the danger that that type of cohabitation entails, when they can simply go to a pharmacy like anybody else with any other medical or psychiatric diagnoses? To be clear, I've never, ever in my life met any addiction physician or addiction treatment provider that thinks that the current regulations around opioid treatment programs are helping patients. And nobody is closer to the issue than those of us who work in the clinics. Likewise, I've never met any patient that thinks that the regulations around opioid treatment programs make any sense. So all of us universally agree that the system is broken. Regarding buprenorphine, a wonderful, somewhat new medication for opioid use disorder, perhaps we can continue to prescribe it via telemedicine indefinitely. We're still prescribing a lot of buprenorphine via telemedicine here at Mount Sinai. We should be doing it elsewhere across the country. Regarding addiction consultation, there should be, I would argue, a hospital-based addiction consult for admitted inpatient as standard of care across this country. Now, again, fortunately here at Sinai, we have an addiction consult service, but that's not true as you travel around New York City or around New York State, and it's definitely not true as you get into more rural parts of the country. Imagine going to a hospital and needing a cardiologist and being told that they simply didn't have one on staff. It would be an outrage. Perhaps a future state of addiction treatment in America might also involve treatment rather than punishment. Perhaps all prisons should offer opioid replacement therapy so that we don't release people after incarceration and just hope that they can find the nearest clinic. And regarding the dreaded confidentiality law of 42 CFR Part 2, perhaps it can be modernized to not just protect patient rights, which is what it was intended to do, but not in the process kneecap physician data sharing. I don't think it makes any ethical sense whatsoever that a physician would not be allowed to know something about a patient, particularly when that information could harm that very patient. And I would suggest to you that all of these reforms represent very low-hanging fruit. And the relaxation of regulations during the COVID-19 pandemic is the perfect opportunity to advocate for additional reforms. At the very least, we shouldn't backslide into the previous framework that we were toiling under up through 2019. The good news is that there does seem to be some momentum in various circles for continuing this path forward. In fact, in candid conversations with regulators, they often concede that the system is far from perfect and needs to change. But how can we get there? Perhaps it's our role as clinicians and researchers to not only talk about and discuss these things at academic symposia like this one, but maybe it's time for us to shout them from the rooftops. One thing that I have to point out to you before I conclude is that while I am talking about opioids, America still has a bad alcohol problem. We see alcohol deaths far exceeding deaths related to opioids, and no talk on addiction is not complete without talking about tobacco. So as clinicians, we think of all these diseases as falling under the same diagnosis of substance use disorder. There's a lot of hope for the future, but we have a long ways to go. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Tim. And let me start with a couple of questions to you specifically before we get back to the other panelists. Diana Salmak is asking a question about how long does it take for an opioid to leave the body if a person just stops taking the drug without treatment? Is it hours, days, weeks? Say a person who uses heroin regularly.
It's a good question. So the body develops what we call not just a physiologic dependence, but a tolerance for products that are addictive. And when it comes to opioids, if somebody's taking an opioid regularly for as little as 2 or 3 weeks, they will suffer from physiologic opioid withdrawal symptoms for probably about 5 to 6 days. That doesn't mean that the actual opioid's still in the body. In fact, it's probably been metabolized off, but they'll still feel the symptoms. Contrasting it with, say, methadone, which is a very long-acting product, it may take 7 days, even longer, for methadone to truly leave the body.
Excellent, thank you. And Hiroko Furo is asking a great question about payment for treatment. I mean, this is one of the major challenges that we face in the United States. Would you comment, please? And Kara touched on this as well earlier, but could you comment, please, on where we are with insurance payments for addiction treatment and what our country needs to do to offer these individuals fair, equal treatment for addiction compared to other disorders?
Of course. So we did make progress with the Affordable Care Act. We did start to see addiction being a bit more in parity with other conditions. But make no mistake, the addiction treatment landscape in America is an industrial complex, and one simply has to Google addiction treatment to see a real spectrum of care. Most of that care is cost prohibitive for most Americans. It's private pay facilities that simply don't take insurance. My own personal view is that we should mandate that all facilities participate in some insurance plans. I don't know why we're paying for insurance when we can't actually use it when the time comes. But it's a very important comment and question that unfortunately is still a big problem for our field.
Well, we fundamentally lack true parity in the sense that if a person has heart disease or cancer or diabetes, that person could show up at any major medical center and receive treatment, whether they have insurance or not. Yet when it comes to behavioral health conditions, psychiatric conditions, including addiction, that's not the case. We have so many people who cannot access care. Okay, so thank you very much. We have just 15 minutes or so left in the program, and I'm going to ask our panelists some questions from the audience, as well as others that I've thought of. Yasmin, let me go back to you. And we have a question from the audience. This is from Brian Reed, who's asking that if cannabidiol is not the active ingredient in marijuana, it's not tetrahydrocannabinol binding to the cannabinoid receptor, what do we know about the mechanism that cannabidiol is working through?
So that's a really important question, one that the world is actually trying to find out right now. So unlike, and I should have answered this earlier, the question of the comparison to THC. So THC is a partial agonist at our endogenous cannabinoid receptors, so CB1, CB2. And CBD is not an agonist there. In fact, it's a negative allosteric modulator, it's called, meaning basically it has an antagonistic effect there. CBD is also interesting in that it tweaks many different transmitter systems. For example, It works as a serotonin 5-HT1A receptor agonist. Adenosine. It also works at a receptor called GPR55 that many people it was considered like an orphan cannabinoid receptor that we're still trying to figure out how it works. But the interesting thing for me when you think about CBD is that I always say it makes me think differently about how we develop medications. Often we develop medications to substitute for something in terms of either having a very potent antagonist that blocks a receptor or potent agonist that elevates a particular signal. CBD, because it tweaks many different transmitter systems, may be one of the reasons why it doesn't have so many bad side effects as we see with, potent agonists and antagonists. And it's that tweaking of basically how the synapse, it's a homeostatic regulator, it looks like. So it's not very specific, but that may be actually a strength because it's a weak activity at all of these neurotransmitter systems.
And Corey Hammond is asking about dose. What types of doses of cannabidiol are you and others using in the human clinical trials?
Yeah, so compared to what people are selling CBD in the stores, 10 and 20 milligrams, clinically, we're using doses. Our first studies were 400 and 800, and others between that range from 200 to 800. And that's the thing right now. We're all trying to figure out what may be the appropriate dose. And remember that cannabinoids have a very poor bioavailability. Only about 5 to 6% gets into the bloodstream from an oral use. So that's why now we're also looking into different types of formulations that enhances the bioavailability, because basically you're just excreting most of the CBD that you pay a lot for. So we're trying to make sure if we're developing medication for cannabis use disorders, back to the payment, we want to make sure that we can develop medications that will be affordable. So that's another thing why we're also looking into routes of administration that improves the bioavailability. So right now, yes, the doses are high, but we believe that that's what's needed to get to pharmacological relevant doses.
Right, and from what you've seen, those high doses are safe.
Yes, and even people who have used much higher doses have seen that even 1,500 milligram CBD did not produce the significant side effects. It's mainly when it's interacting with other medications that people are taking. So, for example, in the studies with children with Epidiolex, it's with anti-epileptic medications that you could have adverse events. So it's really critical that people tell their doctors what other medications they're taking when they're taking something, quote unquote, organic as CBD, because it's not. It's a biologically active compound.
Thank you. And Dr. Gu, returning to you, I'm struck in, as a practicing psychiatrist myself, that we still lack in our field objective laboratory tests to offer our patients to guide diagnosis and prognosis. So, for example, we don't have a brain scan, a blood test, a genetic test in psychiatry the way we do in all other branches of medicine. Your work would seem to raise the specter one day of having a more personalized approach to psychiatric disorders. Would you comment on that? I mean, do you think that we'll have it, that we'll see a day sometime in the next few years where a person might have a brain scan that would help diagnose and then guide treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really one of the biggest areas of, computational psychiatry work. Because one of the most powerful things a model can do is to make predictions, right? And we know that right now we are treating all patients as if they're the same person, ignoring all the, individual differences, how they are different, what their past history is. So absolutely, I think there's two levels. One is individualized and two is objective. And so there are, there's starting to have this sort of the imaging field is starting to build larger and larger databases for this purpose. But again, imaging is maybe more, much more expensive compared to genetics work, right? That's why our sample size has always lagged behind. But I think that, again, with technology advancing very quickly, I'm pretty confident that one day we can lower the cost and make this to be a routine thing. So one day you can show your patient a brain image accompanied by your typical clinical evaluations to say that, hey, whatever we decided to do with you, there is this very objective biological marker we can show you. So that's one. But I'm also very inspired by all the discussions, actually a lot of from Tim's talk, thinking that, again, to make that happen, we have to work very closely with policymakers and with all the things pushing sort of the real world forward, because for a lot of reasons, right, it's not conventionally accepted that if you're an addiction patient, why should you have your scan covered, or why should you have these extra measurements covered by insurance? So that's something that that I think is a very interesting sort of intersection where we can think about. Yeah, but I hope that that day will come soon.
Absolutely. It really does underscore the importance of research in psychiatry and behavioral health, because we just so sorely need those approaches. Dr. Bagot, one of the attendees, Haley Thorpe, is asking whether in your current data set, or whether you have experience in general with transgender youth, and whether you've seen any differences in those individuals with respect to risk for addiction or the way substance use may play out.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there are a significant number of trans individuals within this cohort. And I think that's because, so at Adolescent Health Center, there's a separate trans program for youth, and it's embedded in primary care and has a mental health component as well. So we have separate trans primary care clinicians, as well as—
That's in your Adolescent Health Center, you're saying?
Yeah, here at Sinai in the Adolescent Health Center. So we have actually quite a large number of trans youth that come for medications, and then also get targeted sort of mental health care here as well. And so we know among that population, the trans population, there are very exceptionally high rates of substance use, above and beyond sort of national rates. And there are a number of risk factors that are really unique to that population that lead to those sort of increases in substance use. I think particularly in that population, we tend to see psychopathology precede substance use, and so that's one thing, as well as discrimination and all the rest. So yes, that data is available here.
Very good, thank you. Dr. Brennan, Michael Delman asked an interesting question about telemedicine. You mentioned, and we all know, that the lockdowns during the pandemic had forced psychiatrists, psychotherapists to move to a telemedicine platform. Mr. Delman is asking the question of whether that is somehow furthering the lack of human contact. In other words, what is your opinion of telemedicine, and what's gained versus what might be lost by not having that in-person treatment experience between a treater and a patient?
I don't think you can recreate the dynamic that happens when you're physically present with somebody. I'm not talking about over an internet connection. So without question, the telemedicine has led to greater access to care for people that are sort of spread wide in rural areas. But by no means do I think it's ideal. However, the reality of accessing care is such that even in the rosiest of projections, there is never going to be enough mental health providers for the people that suffer from mental health conditions, including addiction. So as you drive up the Hudson it gets harder and harder to find care. And so modalities like telemedicine, I think, play an important stopgap there. But I agree that there's nothing quite like being present with someone in the room.
Okay, excellent. And so let's make this the last question. I'm going to just raise it and anyone can answer because it's really relevant to all four of your talks. We've focused on drug addiction, but one of the questions today from Bill Williams is whether any of these treatments that you've discussed are suitable for what we refer to sometimes in the field as behavioral addictions, say pathological gambling, pathological overeating, or other types of compulsive behavior that some individuals show. Do any of you have insight into that you'd like to offer? Please just speak up.
Yeah, I can jump onto
Go ahead.
that, because it's actually exactly our point, sort of from the beginning, that if we think these top-down cognitive factors have a role in it, right, then addiction can be happening without substance. I mean, drug addiction tends to be one of the addictions that we deal with mostly. So I know that it's probably still controversial whether certain behavioral compulsivity is considered a true addiction. But there's pathological gambling. Some people consider internet or gaming also to be addiction. Yeah. There's actually sexual addiction as well. But again, that's a very controversial, maybe clinically ambiguous thing. Mm-hmm. And
there's some evidence from brain imaging, in fact, that individuals will show parts of the brain becoming activated either with a substance or in the context of, say, pathological gambling. Or is there not?
Yeah, there is, right? So if somebody, pathological gamblers show similar impairments in these reward pathways. Mm-hmm. But then some people then would argue that then you can call everything addiction, right? If you go to the gym every day, is that addiction? Or, there's people.
Well, we usually separate, that's a really good point, but we usually separate out things that are physiologically necessary for our survival, like food and drink, mm-hmm. or something that's good for us, like moderate exercise, as opposed to something that really can impair our ability to function.
Right. So it's interesting that you mentioned food, because there's also this other thinking that binge eating, for example, or the binging phase of bulimia can be seen as a form of addiction, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, it's not a formal concept. It's not, written anywhere to be considered addiction. But I guess this is kind of the exact point of looking at compulsivity as a sort of this RDoC construct, just go beyond addiction. But
there are a number of, I was going to say, definitely, I agree with Xiaosi. One of the things that there are certain common neurobiological features that you see in both substance and behavioral addictions, but, an aspect also of the cues that drive it, and certain behavioral traits and in people who develop a substance use disorder, you see also in those who develop a behavioral addictions. So can some of these treatments help? Perhaps. And that's why, we do see in animal models when you see changes in the endogenous opioid, the endogenous cannabinoid systems when they have behavioral pathologies are induced. So yes, there are changes that are occurring in the brain, and most likely it comes back again to, is there going to be a one-size-fit-all treatment for everything? No. And so that's why it's really important to identify people early, to really have multifaceted ways of treatment, that we don't just have, say, only methadone or only buprenorphine as treatments for opiate use disorders. Are there people that will always need perhaps an opioid agonist treatment? Yes. But should that be the norm for everyone? No, when we have scientists telling us more about, the brain and the behaviors that we see clinically.
Right. Fantastic. That's a great note to end on. On behalf of our panelists, Dr. Hurd, Gu, Bagot, and Brennan, thank you all very much for great presentations. It's hard to overstate the positive impact that conquering addiction would have on humanity. So thank you for all of your great work and endeavors. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I know that we didn't get to answer every question, but we will record them and do our best to reach out to you with answers in the coming days. So thank you all very much. Good afternoon.